My name is Zoe Alderman. I'm 27 years old. And for nearly 2 years my father called every hiring manager, every recruiter and every business contact in Shreveport, Louisiana and told them I was a scammer. Not a disappointment. Not a troubled kid. A scammer. He used that word deliberately because he knew what it would do. In a city where reputation is currency and everyone knows everyone through 3 degrees of separation, that single word was enough to make sure no one would ever take a chance on me. I had a marketing degree with honors. I had internship experience, recommendation letters, and a portfolio I'd spent 4 years building. None of it mattered. Because Douglas Alderman had already made his calls. He told me once while I was sitting across from him at the dinner table I'd grown up eating at, that he was teaching me a lesson. He said it the way you'd explain a math problem to a slow student. Patient. Certain. Like he was doing me a favor. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his own mother had already been 3 steps ahead of him for 15 years. He didn't know about the account. He didn't know what she'd arranged or why the founder of Castlebridge Creative Group had my name written on a document locked in his office safe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I go any further, if this story is already hitting something real for you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. I promise you this story is only getting started. Now let me take you back to the beginning, back to a house in Shreveport where everything looked fine from the outside and felt like a slow suffocation from the inside. The Alderman family lived in a 2-story house in the South Highland neighborhood, the kind of street where the lawns were always trimmed and the cars in the driveway told you everything you needed to know about the people inside. My father Douglas drove a dark green Range Rover. My mother Patricia drove a pearl white Cadillac. My older brother Eli had a used Audi that Dad had quietly subsidized and called a loan he never intended to collect. The house had a wraparound porch, tall white columns, and a kitchen that smelled like my mother's praline cake every Sunday morning. From the outside it looked like a dream. From the inside it felt like a place where only certain people were allowed to have dreams at all. Douglas Alderman ran a mid-sized logistics company called Alderman Freight Solutions. He'd built it over 20 years through a combination of relentless networking, calculated favors, and an almost surgical understanding of how to make people feel indebted to him. He was respected in Shreveport's business community the way a storm is respected. Not because people liked him but because crossing him had consequences. He sat on the board of 2 local business associations, played golf every Saturday with men who owned half the commercial real estate in the parish, and donated just enough to charity to keep his name in the right circles. Eli was 4 years older than me and had been groomed for the company since he was old enough to ride along on client visits. Dad took him to every meeting, every dinner, every handshake that mattered. By the time Eli finished his business degree at LSU, there was already a desk with his nameplate waiting at Alderman Freight. He was being shaped into a copy of our father and he was happy about it. That always scared me a little. I was the younger one. The daughter. And in our house those 2 things together meant something specific. It didn't mean I was unloved, at least not at first. It meant I was expected to want different things. Smaller things. More manageable things. When I was 15 and told my parents I wanted to study marketing and eventually work in brand strategy, my mother smiled and said that sounded creative. My father looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "Marketing is for people who can't do math." He went back to his newspaper. Conversation over. I went to the University of Louisiana at Monroe on a partial academic scholarship. Dad covered the rest but he made sure I understood it was a transaction, not a gift. Every semester he reminded me what the tuition cost. Every holiday he found a way to work it into conversation. "Still spending my money up in Monroe," he'd say, chuckling in the direction of his golf buddies while I stood there at whatever family gathering we were at, smiling because what else do you do? I graduated with a 3.8 GPA, a concentration in digital marketing, and a senior capstone project that won a regional student competition. My professor, Dr. Sandra Okafor, wrote me a recommendation letter she called the strongest she'd written in 11 years of teaching. I came home to Shreveport in May, portfolio in hand, ready to actually begin my life. I was 22 years old and I felt for the first time like I had something that was entirely mine. Something my father's money hadn't built and his opinion couldn't diminish. Dad had a different idea. The week after I moved back home he sat me down at the kitchen table and slid a piece of paper across to me. It was a job description, typed up and printed on Alderman Freight letterhead. Marketing coordinator, it said at the top. I read through it quickly. It was a real position, or at least it looked like one. Then I got to the bottom. Compensation, negotiable after 1 year. Reporting to Douglas Alderman. I looked up. He was watching me with that expression I'd learned to read over 22 years. The one that looked like patience but was actually the stillness before something inevitable. I appreciate this, Dad, I said carefully. But I'd really like to try applying to agencies first. Get some outside experience, build my resume independently before coming into the family business. He didn't react immediately. He just folded his hands on the table. That's your choice, he said quietly. Make it wisely. I told myself it was fine. That he was just being dramatic. That any father worth the title would want his daughter to succeed on her own terms. I sent out applications that week. 12 of them to marketing agencies, brand consultancies and in-house creative teams across Shreveport and Baton Rouge. My portfolio was strong. My GPA was strong. My recommendation letter from Dr. Okafor was exceptional. I got interviews at 8 of the 12. I didn't get a single offer. At first I thought it was the market. Entry-level creative positions were competitive. Maybe my portfolio needed work. Maybe I'd interviewed poorly. I revised everything. I practiced. I sent out another round of applications. More interviews. Same result. By month 4 I was starting to feel something I hadn't expected to feel after graduating near the top of my class. I was starting to feel like maybe I'd been wrong about myself the whole time. The moment I found out the truth didn't come from a stranger the way you might expect. It came from someone I'd known since middle school. Destiny Broussard had gone to high school with me, and her aunt worked as an office manager at a mid-sized agency called Gulf Coast Brand Partners, one of the firms that had interviewed me twice and gone silent both times. Destiny texted me on a Thursday afternoon asking if we could meet for coffee. Something about her message felt off. Too careful. Too deliberate for a casual catch-up. We met at a coffee shop on Texas Street. She set her cup down, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Zoe, I need to tell you something and I need you to not ask me how I know." My stomach tightened before she even said another word. She told me that her aunt had overheard a conversation at Gulf Coast Brand Partners between the hiring director and a man who had called to discuss my application. The man had introduced himself as a business associate of the Alderman family. He told the hiring director that I had a history of deceptive business practices. That I'd run a fake freelance operation during college, collecting payments from small businesses for work I never delivered. That I'd been asked to leave a student organization over financial misconduct. That the Alderman family had tried to handle it quietly, but the hiring director deserved to know before bringing someone like me onto a team. None of it was true. Not a single word. I sat across from Destiny with my hands wrapped around my coffee cup and felt the floor shift under me. Because I already knew before I could even finish processing what she'd said, exactly whose voice had been on that phone call. That night I drove home in silence. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I kept turning it over in my head trying to find another explanation. Maybe someone else had made that call. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity. But I knew better. I had known better the moment Destiny said the words, Alderman family. Because that was exactly how my father operated. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He made quiet phone calls to the right people and let the damage spread on its own. I went inside and found him in the living room watching a news program. My mother was in the kitchen. Eli was out somewhere. I stood in the doorway and waited until he looked up. When he did, his expression didn't change. Not even slightly. That was how I knew for certain. Guilty people get defensive. My father just looked at me the way he always did, like I was a minor inconvenience in an otherwise well-organized life. I asked him directly. I told him what I'd heard. I told him about the call to Gulf Coast Brand Partners. And he set down his remote, folded his hands in his lap and said, "I told them the truth about who you are." The room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. I told him none of it was true, that I had never scammed anyone, that he had invented every single thing he'd apparently been telling people. He looked at me steadily. "You refuse to come into this family's business," he said. "You think that doesn't have consequences?" He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Douglas Alderman that people never understood when I tried to explain him to anyone. He didn't need to. The cruelty was always delivered at a conversational volume, the way you'd discuss the weather or the price of groceries. He sat there in his armchair with the television still murmuring behind him and told me, without a single tremor of guilt in his voice, that he had made calls. Multiple calls. Not just to Gulf Coast brand partners. To others. He wouldn't tell me how many. He just said, enough. Then he picked up his remote, turned the volume back up, and that was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. I stood there for another few seconds waiting for something more. An explanation. A justification. Even an argument would have felt more human than what he gave me, which was nothing. Just the sight of his face and the blue glow of the television. My mother appeared from the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a dish towel, and the look on her face told me she already knew. Not everything maybe. But enough. She'd known something was happening and she had said nothing, done nothing, stood in her kitchen making praline cake and letting it happen. She gave me a small, pained look that was supposed to mean something like I'm sorry, but I've learned over the years that a look without action is just a feeling someone has about themselves. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't change anything. I walked past her and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time that night. I thought about every interview I'd walked into over the past 4 months. Every hiring manager who had smiled at me across a conference table with warm eyes that cooled over the course of 30 minutes, shifting from interest to something more guarded. I had blamed myself for every single one of those moments. I had gone home after each rejection and pulled apart my portfolio, rewritten my cover letters, practiced new answers to standard questions in front of my bathroom mirror. And all of it, every hour of self-doubt and revision and quiet humiliation, had been completely unnecessary. I hadn't been failing. I'd been sabotaged. There's a difference, and the distance between those two things felt like standing on opposite sides of the Mississippi. The following weeks were a specific kind of miserable. I kept applying because I didn't know what else to do. I applied to positions in Baton Rouge, in Lafayette, in Lake Charles, casting wider with every round because I was starting to understand, even before I could fully admit it to myself, that the damage in Shreveport might already be total. My father's network was extensive and deeply embedded in the regional business community. He'd spent 2 decades building relationships across logistics, construction, commercial real estate, and local finance. The marketing and creative industry in Louisiana wasn't separate from those worlds. It overlapped with them constantly. A logistics company needed branding. A real estate firm needed campaigns. Everyone knew everyone, and Douglas Alderman had made sure that everyone knew about me. I took a job at a print shop on Uri Drive just to cover rent on the small apartment I'd moved into after the confrontation with my father. It wasn't glamorous. I ran the front counter, helped customers with design files, operated the laminating machine, and closed up on weeknights. The owner, a quiet man named Mr. Thibodeau, didn't ask questions and didn't require references. He needed someone reliable who showed up on time. I was both of those things, and for the moment that had to be enough. Some nights I'd be closing down the shop, stacking paper reams in the back room, and I'd think about Dr. Okafor's recommendation letter sitting in my portfolio folder on my laptop. Strongest letter I've written in 11 years. I'd think about the regional competition trophy on my childhood bookshelf at my parents' house, the one I'd never bothered taking with me when I left because it felt too heavy to carry. Not physically, just in every other way. Eli called me once during that period. It was a Sunday evening and I was eating takeout alone in my apartment, watching nothing in particular on my laptop. He asked how I was doing in the tone people use when they already know the answer and are calling to discharge an obligation rather than actually connect. I told him I was fine. He said that was good. Then he said, "Dad's just trying to look out for the family, Zoe. You know how he is." I asked him if he knew what Dad had been telling people about me. There was a pause. "He mentioned you'd been difficult about the job offer," Eli said carefully. Difficult. That was the word he used. I'd been difficult. I told him what I knew, what Destiny had told me, what Dad had confirmed with his own mouth. Another pause. Longer this time. "I mean," Eli said finally, "maybe there's more to it than you're seeing." I hung up. I didn't call him back. There's something that happens to you when the people closest to you decide, one by one, that the story being told about you is more convenient to believe than the truth. It's not like a single blow. It's more like erosion. Every conversation where someone looks at you a little sideways, every former acquaintance who seems to have heard something and doesn't quite know how to act around you anymore, every door that closes just before you can get your foot in it. It wears at the edges of who you are. I started to feel it happening, that slow erosion, and the worst part was recognizing it and being unable to stop it. The gossip had moved beyond professional circles. That was something I discovered around month 6. I'd gone to a birthday gathering for a friend from college, one of the few people who had stayed in contact, and I'd noticed the way a small group in the corner of the room went quiet when I walked past them. I recognized 2 of them as acquaintances from my parents' social circle. After the party, my friend Tamara pulled me aside on the front porch and told me apologetically that she'd been hearing things. Not specifics. Just a general cloud of something that followed my name now. "People are saying your family had to cut you off," Tamara said, picking her words carefully. "That there was some kind of financial thing. I don't believe it, obviously. But I thought you should know it's out there." I thanked her. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex and pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and tried to remember what it had felt like to walk across a stage in May holding a diploma I'd genuinely earned. That was when I remembered my grandmother. Not that I'd ever forgotten her, but I remembered her in a specific way. I remembered a conversation we'd had when I was 12 years old, sitting on the back steps of her house in the Garden District of New Orleans where she'd lived for the last 20 years of her life. Her name was Loretta Voss. My father's mother. Which had always struck me as one of life's more ironic arrangements, that the warmest, most clear-eyed person in our family had somehow produced Douglas. She'd built a small empire of her own over her lifetime, starting with a single event planning business she'd launched in her 30s and eventually expanding into venue ownership, hospitality consulting, and a handful of strategic investments she made with the kind of quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself. On those back steps when I was 12, she had taken my hand the way she did sometimes when she had something important to say, something she wanted to make sure landed properly. She told me that I reminded her of herself. She said it without flattery as a statement of fact. She said, "Your father loves control more than he loves people, Zoe. I raised him and I know what he is. I want you to know that I see what you are too, and they are not the same thing." I hadn't fully understood what she meant then. I was 12. I thought she was just being warm the way grandmothers are warm. But she hadn't stopped there. She'd said something else, something I'd filed away without understanding its weight. She told me that she'd already started preparing something for me. That when the time came I would have options my father didn't know about and couldn't reach. I'd asked her what she meant. She just squeezed my hand and smiled. "You'll know when you need to know," she said. "Just keep going forward." Grandma Loretta passed away 2 years before I graduated college. She was 74. The grief had been the kind that catches you off guard months later in ordinary moments, in the smell of jasmine, in the sight of old paperback books on a shelf. What I hadn't done in the fog of grief and then the chaos of finishing my final year of school and then the rush of graduation and the immediate pressure of job hunting, was look carefully at what she'd left behind. My father had handled the estate. He told the family it was straightforward. A modest inheritance split between her children, some donations to causes she cared about, personal items distributed according to a list she'd left with her attorney. Nothing unusual. Nothing that required my attention specifically. It hadn't occurred to me to question that. He was her son. He'd managed the process. I had been 22, grieving and overwhelmed, and I had simply taken his word for it the way I'd taken his word for so many things before I learned better. It was only now, sitting alone in my car in a dark parking lot in Shreveport with my reputation in pieces and my career at a standstill, that I started to wonder. She had told me she was preparing something. She had been specific about it. She had looked me in the eyes on those back steps and said it with the kind of deliberateness that didn't leave room for it to be casual. And my father had handled her estate alone, without involving me, without suggesting I speak to her attorney directly. That thought sat in my chest like a stone and didn't go away. I started with the only name I had. Loretta Voss had used an attorney for most of her professional life, a man named Philip Carver who had handled contracts for her event planning business and later her venue acquisitions. I remembered his name because Grandma had mentioned him a handful of times, always with firm respect, the way you talk about someone who has never let you down. I found his firm online, Carver and Associates, still operating out of a converted Victorian on St. Charles Avenue in New Orleans. I called on a Tuesday morning from the print shop break room, door closed, voice low. The receptionist told me Philip Carver had retired 3 years ago. My stomach dropped before she finished the sentence. But she kept talking. She said his cases had been transferred to a younger partner at the firm, a woman named Denise Arsenault, and that some of the older estate files were still housed with them pending final disposition. I asked if there was anything in their records related to Loretta Voss. Pause. Keyboard clicks. Another pause, longer this time. She told me she couldn't discuss file contents over the phone, but that if I was a named party in any document associated with that estate, I was entitled to request a formal review. She asked for my full name. There was a silence on the line that lasted just a beat too long to be ordinary. Then she said, "Ms. Alderman, I'd recommend you come in person. At your earliest convenience." I told Mr. Thibodeau I needed a personal day. He looked at me for a moment over the top of his reading glasses and then nodded once, the way people do when they can tell something important is happening and they're decent enough not to make it harder. I drove to New Orleans the next morning. 3.5 hours down I-49 with the windows cracked and the radio off, turning the same thoughts over and over the entire way. What had Grandma left? Why had the attorney's office gone quiet on the phone when I said my name? And what exactly had my father done with her estate when she died? Denise Arsenault was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of measured calm that good attorneys wear like a second skin. She met me in a conference room with pale green walls and a window that looked out onto a courtyard full of overgrown banana plants. She had a file folder on the table in front of her, thick, with a rubber band around it that looked like it had been there a while. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at me first, assessed something, and then said, "I want to be straightforward with you, Ms. Alderman, because I think you deserve that. This file has been waiting for you for a long time, and the reason it's still here instead of resolved is something you need to understand before I show you what's inside." She told me that when Loretta Voss passed away, Philip Carver had attempted to contact me directly as a named beneficiary in a secondary instrument attached to her estate. Not the primary will, which had been handled by the family in the way my father described, modest distributions, charitable donations, straightforward. But there was a second document, a separate legal instrument that Loretta had executed independently and specifically instructed should be delivered to me directly, not to the family, not to the executor, to me alone. Carver had called the number on file. The number was a landline at my parents' house. My father had answered. He'd told Carver that I was unavailable and that he would pass along the message. He never did. When Carver followed up a second time, my father told him I had been made aware of the correspondence and had chosen not to respond. Carver, elderly and operating in good faith, had noted the file accordingly and moved on. The document had sat in trust ever since, waiting for the day I walked through the door myself. I sat very still in that green conference room while Denise finished explaining. There was a specific kind of rage building in my chest, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't come out as noise but as absolute clarity. My father had intercepted the attorney's calls. He had spoken on my behalf without my knowledge. He had told a legal professional that I wasn't interested in my own grandmother's bequest, and he had done it so smoothly, so confidently, that it had worked for years. That was Douglas Alderman. He didn't just lie. He lied with the authority of a man who had never once been caught, and so the lie held the shape of the truth until someone finally pushed on it. Denise slid the folder across the table and removed the rubber band. Inside was a document on heavy cream paper, notarized, dated 11 years ago, about a year after that conversation on the back steps in the Garden District. At the top, in clean formal type, it read, "Instrument of Designated Beneficiary Interest. Loretta Jean Voss." I scanned the language carefully, slowly, the way Dr. Okafor had taught me to read anything that mattered. It took me 2 full passes to understand what I was looking at. Grandma Loretta had held a private equity stake in a company called Castlebridge Creative Group, a mid-sized brand strategy and creative agency headquartered in Houston, Texas, with regional offices in Austin and New Orleans. She had acquired the stake 8 years before she died through a direct investment at the company's founding, when the founder, a woman named Renata Hale, had been looking for early backers, and Loretta had been one of the few people willing to write a check based on nothing but a business plan and a firm handshake. The stake was 12% of the company. And 11 years ago, Loretta had transferred the beneficial ownership of that stake into a trust with a single named beneficiary. My name. Zoe Marie Alderman. I had to read it 3 times. Then I set the paper down on the table, pressed both palms flat against the cool surface and breathed. Denise waited. She was good at waiting. Outside the window a bird landed in the banana plants and then disappeared again. I asked her why the document specified Castlebridge Creative Group specifically. Why had Grandma structured it around that particular company rather than simply leaving me money? Denise said she couldn't speak to Loretta's reasoning since she hadn't drafted the document herself, but there was a personal letter attached to the instrument, sealed, addressed to me in Grandma's handwriting, with instructions that it only be opened by me in the presence of the attorney. I picked up the envelope. My name on the front in that familiar looping script, the same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and recipe notes my whole childhood. I opened it carefully. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on her personal stationery, pale ivory with a small sprig of jasmine printed at the top. She wrote the way she talked, direct and warm at the same time, like she was sitting across from you and looking you in the eye. She said she'd been watching me since I was small. She said she'd seen the way my father talked about my future as though it were a thing he owned the rights to, a property he could develop or leave fallow according to his own interests. She wrote that she had loved her son but had never confused loving him with trusting him. Those were 2 different things, she said, and it had taken her too long in life to understand that clearly enough to act on it. He told me about Renata Hale. She wrote that Renata had come to her through a mutual contact 12 years ago, a young woman building something real from the ground up in an industry that didn't make space for people easily. She'd invested because she believed in Renata's vision, but she'd structured the stake in my name because she had a different reason for wanting Castlebridge to grow. She wrote, "I have watched your mind work since you were old enough to form an argument, and I know what field belongs to you. When you are ready, and you will be ready, Renata will know your name. She will be expecting you. Not because I told her everything but because I told her enough. Go to her, Zoe. Go to Houston. Walk through that door." I folded the letter. I held it against my chest for a moment, the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping. Denise was quiet across the table. When I looked up, my eyes were burning, but I wasn't going to cry in that conference room. I was too focused. Too suddenly, electrifyingly focused. I asked Denise what the stake was currently worth. She pulled a separate sheet from the folder, a valuation summary prepared by the firm at Loretta's instruction, to be updated annually until claimed. The most recent figure was from 8 months ago. Castlebridge Creative Group had grown substantially in the years since Loretta's initial investment. The 12% stake had a current estimated value of just over $1.8 million. I drove back to Shreveport that evening in a completely different state of mind. Something had shifted. Not my circumstances yet, those were still the same print shop, the same apartment, the same ruined reputation. But something inside had rearranged itself. All this time I had been operating under the assumption that I was losing. That the wall my father had built around my future was solid and without doors. And here was a door. Not a lucky accident. A door my grandmother had spent years quietly installing in the exact wall she'd known he would build. I didn't call anyone that night. I sat at my kitchen table with Grandma's letter in front of me and looked up Castlebridge Creative Group on my laptop. Their website was clean and confident, exactly the kind of brand presence that told you the people behind it understood what they were doing. The founder, Renata Hale, had a brief bio on the About page. Former creative director, launched Castlebridge 9 years ago. In her headshot she looked mid-40s, approachable and serious at the same time. Someone who had built something real. I skipped the contact form and typed directly to the address listed for the founder's office. I wrote 3 sentences. My name is Zoe Alderman. My grandmother was Loretta Voss. I believe you've been expecting me. Renata Hale replied within 4 hours. I was back at the print shop the next morning, running a lamination job for a customer who wanted 50 glossy menus for a restaurant opening, when my phone buzzed on the counter beside me. I almost didn't check it. Then I saw the sender. rhale@castlebridgecreative.com. My hands stopped moving. The customer was still talking about card stock options. I heard none of it. The email was brief and precise. Exactly the kind of message someone writes when they've been waiting for it to arrive for a long time and have already decided what they're going to say. She wrote that she remembered Loretta Voss with tremendous fondness and gratitude. She wrote that she had been told years ago that one day a woman named Zoe Alderman would reach out and that when she did, Renata should treat the conversation as a priority. She said she would like to meet in person at the Castlebridge Houston office at my earliest convenience, and that she would have her assistant arrange travel if that would be helpful. She signed it simply Renata. I finished the lamination job. I thanked the customer. I waited until the shop was empty and then I went to the back room and sat down on an overturned paper crate and read the email 4 more times. She had been told years ago. Loretta had contacted her directly. My grandmother had not just invested money into a company and hoped for the best. She had made a phone call or written a letter or sat across from Renata Hale at some point and said, "My granddaughter is coming. Watch for her." That level of deliberateness made something swell in my chest that I didn't have an immediate word for. It was somewhere between grief and gratitude and a kind of awe I'd never felt for another person before. I replied the same afternoon and said I could travel the following week. Renata's assistant responded within the hour. Train ticket confirmation, hotel reservation near the Galleria, a calendar invite for Thursday at 10 in the morning. All of it handled with a quiet efficiency that told me this meeting had been mentally scheduled for years, waiting for a date to attach itself to. I didn't tell my father I was going to Houston. I didn't tell Eli. I told Tamara because she was the one person in my life at that point who had consistently told me the truth even when it was uncomfortable, and I needed someone to know where I was going in case everything went sideways in a way I couldn't predict. She drove me to the train station on Wednesday evening and stood on the platform with her arms crossed against the evening chill. "Zoe," she said, "your grandmother saw something in you worth $1 million investment. That is not a small thing." I told her I was trying not to think about the number. She said thinking about the number was probably less terrifying than thinking about the meeting. The train pulled away and I watched the Shreveport skyline flatten into dark highway and tree line and eventually nothing. I arrived in Houston on a Thursday morning with a portfolio I had stayed up until midnight updating, a second-hand blazer I'd pressed twice, and the kind of focused calm that sometimes arrives on the far side of a sleepless night when there's simply nothing left to be anxious about. The Castlebridge Creative Group office occupied the top 2 floors of a modern building off Post Oak Boulevard. The lobby had exposed brick on one wall and a gallery of campaign work on the opposite side, print ads, digital mock-ups, brand identity systems, the kind of work that gets submitted to industry competitions and wins. I stood in front of it for a moment before checking in at the front desk. This was real. This was the kind of agency I had applied to from my bedroom in Shreveport with a fresh degree and a portfolio I'd built from scratch. These were the walls I had been trying to get inside for almost 2 years. Renata Hale came down to the lobby to meet me herself rather than sending an assistant. That told me something immediately. She was exactly as she appeared in the headshot, mid-40s, direct posture, a handshake that was firm without performing firmness. She had the kind of face that had probably always looked a decade younger than her age and had made peace with that long ago. She looked at me the way someone looks at a person they've been curious about for a long time but have been patient about. She said, "It's very good to finally meet you, Zoe." She said it like she meant both words. Finally and meet. She took me upstairs to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows facing west. The Houston skyline stretched out behind her desk like a backdrop someone had deliberately chosen. We sat across from each other at a round table near the window rather than across the formality of a desk, which I noticed and appreciated. She poured coffee from a French press without asking if I wanted any, just set a cup in front of me, and then folded her hands and said, "Tell me about yourself. Not your resume. You." That question, the specific way she framed it, was the first time in a very long time that someone in a professional context had asked me something that assumed I was a full person rather than a set of qualifications to be evaluated. I took a breath. And then I told her. Not everything, not the whole accumulated weight of the past 2 years, but the shape of it. The degree I'd earned. The job offers that evaporated. The conversation with destiny. The confrontation with my father. The trip to New Orleans. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out the window, and then she said, "Loretta told me some of this. Not the specifics, but the shape. She said her son was a man who needed to own things and that you were someone who needed to be free of him. She said those 2 facts were going to collide eventually, and she wanted to make sure you had somewhere to land." We talked for 2 hours. Not just about the stake, though we covered that. Denise Arsenault had already been in contact with Castlebridge's legal team and the transfer of beneficial ownership was moving through the proper channels. We talked about the company, where it was headed, what a 12% stakeholder with a marketing degree and a specific personal understanding of being underestimated might actually contribute beyond the financial. Renata was building something. She was in the middle of a significant expansion into the Gulf Coast market, which meant New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and yes, Shreveport among others. She needed people who understood those markets not just statistically but culturally, personally. She looked at me across the table and said, I have a brand strategist position opening at the end of next month. Senior level. It's a reach for someone at your experience stage, but I've read your portfolio and I've talked to your professor. I went still. Dr. Okafor. Renata had called Dr. Okafor. She told me, Renata said with a slight smile, that it was the strongest recommendation letter she'd written in 11 years. I took the position. I gave Mr. Thibodeau 2 weeks' notice and he shook my hand across the print shop counter and said, I knew from the day you walked in here that you weren't going to be here long. He meant it kindly. I believed him. I packed my apartment into a rented trailer and drove to Houston on a Saturday in early autumn with every window down and the radio loud. The city rose up ahead of me on the highway, enormous and indifferent and full of people who had never heard of Douglas Alderman. My first month at Castlebridge was the kind of hard that feels like growth rather than punishment, which is a distinction I had become very sensitive to. I was learning the systems, building relationships with colleagues, getting my bearings in a city where nobody looked at me sideways in the grocery store. My portfolio of projects began to take shape. I was good at the work. I had always been good at the work. The only thing that had ever stood between me and a room like this was my father's voice on the other end of someone else's phone line. It was during my second month in Houston that Douglas made his next move. I had been expecting something, some response to my disappearance from Shreveport, some consequence for having left the orbit he'd been trying to keep me locked in. What I had not expected was the specific form it took. Eli called me on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual enough that I answered. He said, Dad knows about Castlebridge. My blood temperature dropped about 3 degrees. I asked him how. Eli was quiet for a moment and then said, he had someone look into your social media. You posted a photo from the Houston skyline. One photo. A single image I'd put up on a quiet Sunday afternoon because I was happy and didn't think anyone was still watching that closely. I had been careless in exactly the same way I'd been careless with the bus station post, and I had no one to blame for it but myself. Eli said Dad had made some calls. That he'd spoken to someone who knew someone with a connection to a client of Castlebridge's. That he was working the same playbook he'd always worked, quiet phone calls, controlled language, the scammer story dusted off and deployed into a new city. My stomach was tight as I listened. Then Eli said something I didn't expect. His voice shifted into something quieter, less certain than his usual delivery. He said, Zoe, I think you should know that I told him to stop. I waited. He didn't listen, Eli continued. He never does. But I want you to know I said it. Thanked him. I didn't know yet what to do with the fact that my brother had finally found the edge of his own tolerance, but I filed it away carefully. Because I had a feeling I was going to need it soon. I hung up and sat for a long time in my Houston apartment looking at the city lights below. Then I called Renata. Renata picked up on the second ring. I told her everything Eli had said, the social media surveillance, the phone calls, the same strategy Douglas had used in Shreveport now being aimed at Houston. I expected her to be alarmed. She wasn't. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, I received a call this afternoon from someone claiming to represent a potential partner firm. They asked pointed questions about a new hire, described certain alleged past conduct. Pause. I recognized the pattern immediately. Loretta warned me this might happen. I asked her what she meant. She said, when your grandmother asked me to watch for you, she also told me that if I ever received information about you from an outside source casting doubt on your character, I should consider the source before I considered the claim. She said, and I'm quoting her here, that the call would come from a direction that was trying to close a door, not protect me. I sat there in my apartment with the city humming 14 floors below and felt my grandmother's hand reach across a decade and steady me. Renata said she had not engaged with the caller beyond a polite acknowledgement that she received all inquiries in writing. She had then flagged it to Castlebridge's legal counsel. She told me this in the same measured tone she used for everything, calm and completely unbothered, the way a person sounds when they have already decided their position and the opposition's move has not changed it. Then she said something that I wrote down on the back of a takeout receipt and kept for a long time afterward. She said, Zoe, your father is operating under the assumption that your value is something he controls. The fact that he's still trying tells me he hasn't figured out yet that he lost that control the moment you walked into this building. The call with Renata settled something in me. Not complacency, I wasn't foolish enough for that. Douglas hadn't stopped and he wasn't going to stop on his own. But I understood now that I was no longer operating without cover. I had a company behind me. I had a legal instrument in my name. I had a founder who had been briefed by my grandmother to expect exactly this kind of interference and had built a quiet readiness around it. The ground under me was different from what it had been in Shreveport. He was still throwing the same punch, but this time there was a wall between his fist and my face. 2 weeks later, Renata called a meeting. Not with me alone, but with me and 3 senior members of the Castlebridge team, the head of legal, the chief operating officer, and the director of client relations. She laid out what had happened with the outside call. She also presented documentation that her legal team had compiled, a timeline of the interference campaign Douglas had run in the Shreveport market, sourced through statements from 2 of the agencies that had rejected me, both of whom had since expressed regret about their decisions and provided written accounts of the calls they had received. Destiny's aunt had also submitted a written statement through a Shreveport attorney she'd contacted on her own initiative. When Renata finished presenting, the head of legal looked across the table at me and said, "Ms. Alderman, what you're describing is tortious interference. There's a case here if you want to pursue it." I looked at Renata. She looked back without steering me either direction. This was my call. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about what a lawsuit would cost in time and energy and the specific kind of emotional excavation that legal proceedings require. I thought about the version of myself that wanted justice through formal channels and the version of myself that simply wanted to be left alone to build something. I thought about Grandma Loretta and what she would have said. She had been a practical woman. She believed in building things that lasted rather than fighting battles that consumed everything while you were winning them. In the end, I told the legal team that I wasn't ready to file anything yet, but that I wanted the documentation preserved and ready. They said that was a reasonable position. I think they also understood that I was watching to see what Douglas would do next before I decided what I needed to do in response. What he did next arrived in a form I hadn't predicted. A feature article. A regional business publication based in Shreveport called the Parish Report ran a story about Alderman Freight Solutions, a profile piece about Douglas and his 20 years building the company. It was largely favorable, the kind of article that gets commissioned when someone makes a well-placed call to an editor they know. But buried in the middle of the piece was a paragraph about his family, written in the careful language of sympathetic implication rather than direct accusation. It mentioned that Douglas had navigated a difficult period with a family member who had pursued opportunities outside the business, that the separation had been painful, and that there had been questions about the nature of that person's professional conduct that remained unresolved. No names. But everyone in Shreveport who knew the Alderman family would know exactly who was being discussed. It was a print version of what he'd been doing on the phone for 2 years. Controlled. Designed to keep the cloud over my name without giving me anything concrete to challenge. I read the article on a Thursday evening sitting at my desk at Castlebridge after everyone else had gone home. The office was quiet, just the hum of the building's ventilation and the distant sound of Houston traffic below. I read the paragraph 3 times. Then I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice careful the way it always was when she could tell the conversation was going to require something from her. I told her I'd read the article. She was quiet. I asked her directly whether she had known about it before it was published. Another silence, longer this time. Then she said very quietly, "I didn't know what was in it until it ran." I asked her if that meant she'd known it was coming but not what it contained. She didn't answer that. Her silence was its own answer. I told her that I wasn't calling to ask her to choose between me and my father because I already understood what that choice looked like and I wasn't going to put either of us through the performance of it. What I was calling to tell her was that things were about to change, and I wanted her to hear it from me before she heard it from anyone else. She asked what I meant. I told her I had an opportunity coming up in the next few weeks that would make certain things public that had been private until now. That the truth about what Douglas had done was going to stop being something only a handful of people knew. She was very still on the phone. I could hear her breathing. She said, "Zoe, please don't do anything that hurts this family." I told her that what hurt the family was the conduct, not the revelation of it. I said it without anger. I meant it without anger. She started to cry quietly, the muffled kind, the kind she'd been doing my entire life in private when she thought no one could tell. I said, "Mom, I love you. But I can't keep protecting people from the consequences of what they chose to do." I hung up gently. The opportunity one had referred to was something Renata had been quietly arranging for the past month. Castlebridge Creative Group was hosting its annual client summit, a 2-day event held at a conference center in Houston where the company presented its strategic direction, celebrated partnerships, and introduced new members of the leadership team. It drew clients from across the Gulf Coast market, including several from Louisiana. Including Renata had confirmed through a registration list she showed me with a careful expression, a representative from Alderman Freight Solutions. Not Douglas himself. He hadn't been invited personally. But a business development manager from his company had registered under the general client invitation that had gone out through a regional logistics network. Someone in my father's orbit would be in that room. I want to be clear about something. I did not arrange for Douglas or anyone connected to him to be there. That was circumstance or something that felt enough like it that I couldn't call it anything else. But when Renata told me, I understood immediately why she had told me in person rather than over the phone, and why she'd watched my face when she said it. She wanted to know what I was going to do with the information. I thought about it for a full minute while she waited. Then I told her I didn't want to adjust anything about the event because of it. I told her I wanted to do exactly what we had planned. Stand up in front of that room, be introduced as a senior strategist and a stakeholder of the company, and let the truth be visible to whoever was there to see it. No orchestration. No confrontation. Just the plain and undecorated fact of who I was and what I had built and what my grandmother had built for me. Renata nodded slowly. Then she said, Loretta told me once that the best way to answer a lie is not with an argument. It's with evidence. She smiled. I think she'd be very pleased with the evidence. The summit was in 11 days. I went home that night and took Grandma's letter out of the drawer where I kept it and read it again from the beginning. I read it slowly, the way you read something you want to absorb rather than just consume. When I finished, I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. She had written it not knowing exactly how things would unfold. She had written it trusting that if she built the foundation solidly enough, I would find my way to whatever needed to be built on top of it. 11 days. I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope and started preparing. The Castlebridge Client Summit was held at the Whitmore Conference Center in Midtown Houston. I arrived early before most of the attendees, and stood in the main hall watching the event staff arrange name placards and set out branded materials. The room held close to 300 people by 9 o'clock. I recognized faces from the Houston business community, clients from across the Gulf Coast, partners from Louisiana and Dallas. Near the back right section, a man I didn't know personally wore a lanyard that read Alderman Freight Solutions. Mid-30s, scrolling his phone with the distracted energy of someone who hadn't yet found anyone useful to talk to. He had no idea who I was. I intended to keep it that way until it no longer mattered. Renata opened the summit with 40 minutes of strategic overview, the company's performance over the past year, the Gulf Coast expansion plan, key client wins. She was a composed and precise speaker, the kind who never uses a word they don't mean and never fills silence with sound just to fill it. The room was attentive. I sat in the front row beside the CEO and kept my hands still in my lap and breathed. My name was on the printed agenda. Senior Brand Strategist and Founding Stakeholder Introduction. It was right there in black and white for anyone who had looked at the program. I wondered if the man from Alderman Freight had read it. I wondered if the name had registered. I supposed I was about to find out. Renata introduced me midway through the morning session without editorializing. She said that Castlebridge was proud to formally introduce a new member of its senior team and to acknowledge, for the first time publicly, that a founding stakeholder interest had recently been activated after years held in trust. She stated my name and my role, noted that my grandmother Loretta Voss had been among the earliest believers in Castlebridge, and that she had structured her investment to ensure the company and I would find each other when the time was right. She called Loretta a woman of extraordinary foresight. Then she gestured toward me and began to applaud. I stood and turned to face the room. 300 people, some applauding warmly, some curious, some already leaning toward their neighbors to ask quiet questions. I found the Alderman Freight lanyard immediately. The man had stopped scrolling his phone. He was looking at me with a particular kind of attention, the kind that happens when a name clicks into a context it wasn't expected to occupy. I watched him look down at the program, look back up at me. I held his gaze for exactly 1 second and then I looked away because he wasn't who I was there for. I was there for the room. I was there for the work. I was there because my grandmother had built a door 11 years ago and I had finally walked through it, and that deserved to be witnessed by more than just the walls of a law office in New Orleans. I spoke for 10 minutes. I talked about the Gulf Coast expansion, about what I intended to bring to the markets I understood personally, about what it meant to work for a company whose founder had once received a check from a woman who believed in vision before there was evidence to support it. I didn't mention my father. I didn't perform any of the things I had been practicing in my apartment in the weeks before. I just spoke honestly about the work, and the room listened, and when I sat back down the applause was real and unambiguous. The CEO leaned over and said quietly, "Loretta would have loved this." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice right then. The man from Alderman Freight left before the lunch break, sliding out of his row with his phone already at his ear. I knew what call he was making. I felt a small, not entirely comfortable satisfaction imagining Douglas receiving news that his daughter had just been introduced to 300 Gulf Coast business contacts as a stakeholder and senior strategist. Then I let it go. I had other things to attend to. What came next happened over the following weeks rather than in a single dramatic moment, which I think is how real things usually happen. 3 clients at the summit requested follow-up meetings specifically with me. 2 of them were from Louisiana, which meant those conversations would carry back into the market Douglas had tried to close to me. Renata assigned me the Gulf Coast expansion portfolio as my primary responsibility, making me the face of Castlebridge in the exact region where my father had spent 2 years dismantling my reputation. I sat with the irony of that until it stopped feeling like irony and started feeling like geometry. The longest distance between 2 points had turned out to be a straight line drawn years before I needed it. Douglas called me on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the summit. I was in my office reviewing a brand brief for a Baton Rouge hospitality client when my phone lit up with a number I hadn't heard from in months. I stared at it through 2 full rings. Then I answered. His voice was different from what I remembered. Not softer exactly, but compressed, like something that had been under pressure long enough to change its shape. He said my name. I said hello. A silence stretched between us that neither of us moved to fill. Then he said, "I heard about the summit." I said yes. Another silence. He said, "The shares. Your grandmother." He stopped. Started again. I didn't know about the shares. I believed him. Loretta had built that instrument in silence specifically so that he couldn't reach it, and the fact that it had worked was both a tribute to her and a precise measurement of exactly how well she had understood her own son. I told him I knew he hadn't known. He was quiet. Then he said, "I want you to understand that what I did, the calls, I thought I was protecting the family." I listened without responding. I thought if I could keep you close, keep you in the business, things would be better for everyone. I still said nothing. He said, "I see now that I was wrong." The words came out slowly, with the particular difficulty of someone who has spent a lifetime not saying them. I told him I appreciated that he'd said it and that I meant that. I also told him an acknowledgement was not the same as a repair, and I wasn't offering absolution. I was not interested in punishing him. The documentation existed, the legal option remained open, and I had chosen not to pursue it because I didn't want the excavation, not because he deserved the grace. My decision could change if his behavior did. He said he understood. I told him I hoped so, then ended the call. I sat at my desk afterward looking at nothing in particular. There was no rush of triumph. No sudden lightness the way the movies suggest there should be. Just a quiet settling, like a building that has been slightly tilted finally finding level. I had not forgiven everything and was not sure I ever would completely. But I had said what needed to be said, held the line I needed to hold, and ended the call without cruelty. That felt like enough for one Thursday afternoon. Eli texted me that evening. He said he'd spoken to Dad. He said it had seemed like something had shifted. He asked if we could have a proper conversation sometime, just the 2 of us, without the weight of our parents' dynamic pressing down on it. I told him yes. I meant it cautiously but genuinely. People are capable of changing the angles from which they look at things sometimes. Whether Eli had actually done that or whether he was managing his own discomfort through the appearance of reconciliation, I didn't know yet. I was willing to find out slowly. My mother sent a card. Handwritten, which told me she'd spent time with it. She said she was proud of me, which was the first time she had ever written those words to me directly. She said she wished things had been different. He said she loved me. I put the card on my kitchen table and looked at it for 2 days before putting it in the drawer with Grandma's letter. I wrote back briefly and told her I loved her too. That part was true and had always been true regardless of everything else. 6 months into the role, I led the pitch that won Castlebridge its largest Gulf Coast contract to date, a regional hospitality brand with 12 properties across Louisiana and Texas. Renata called me into her office after the client confirmed and set a glass of sparkling water on the desk between us with the quiet ceremony of someone marking a moment. She said, "Loretta picked well." I smiled. Outside her window, the Houston skyline was lit up gold in the late afternoon sun, every building doing its own particular work, indifferent and magnificent. I thought about the print shop on Uri Drive, the lamination machine, the stacked paper reams in the back room, the regional competition trophy I'd left behind on a childhood bookshelf because it had felt too heavy to carry. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like evidence. It felt like a beginning that had been waiting a long time to finally become the middle of something. I still have Grandma's letter. I read it less often now, not because I need it less but because I carry it differently. She told me to build something that belonged to me. I am building it. She told me that the people who truly love you give you options rather than conditions. I understand that now in a way I didn't when I was young enough to think love and control were sometimes the same thing. They are not. They have never been. And the distance between them, it turns out, is exactly the size of a life you build on your own terms. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.